The smell reached him before anything else did. Captain Robert Aldrich had been a military physician for 11 years. He had treated shrapnel wounds in field stations, set broken bones in mobile units, and watched men die from infections that penicillin arrived too late to stop. He believed he had learned over those 11 years to separate the clinical from the emotional, to see a wound and think about it the way a carpenter thinks about a crack in a beam, measurable, solvable, or not. But when he knelt in front of the wooden bench in the intake examination tent at Camp Hearn, Texas on that January morning in 1945 and began to cut the laces of the left boot belonging to prisoner 4412, the smell that rose from the leather stopped him cold. It was not the smell of sweat or mud or unwashed skin. It was something older and deeper than any of those things. It was the smell of tissue that had stopped being alive. The smell of something that had already begun the slow process of returning to the earth, even though the person it belonged to was still sitting upright on the bench, eyes fixed on a spot on the tent wall, breathing in and breathing out with the mechanical steadiness of a man who had decided not to feel anything at all. Aldrich leaned back for 1 second. Just one. Then he leaned forward again and kept cutting. He removed the boot, then the sock or what remained of it. The sock had fused to the skin in several places, and he used surgical scissors to peel it away in sections, careful not to tear what little living tissue might still be underneath. When the foot was fully exposed, the examination tent went quiet in a way that examination tents are not supposed to go quiet. Both feet, as it turned out, were the same. All 10 toes had turned black. The skin across the top of both feet was mottled purple and gray, like a sky before a storm that has already decided what it is going to do. When Aldrich pressed one finger gently against the blackened flesh, there was no reaction from the young man on the bench. No flinch, no intake of breath, no narrowing of the eyes. No pain meant no living nerve, and no living nerve meant the tissue was already gone. Aldrich looked up at the prisoner, 19 years old according to the intake paperwork, 5 feet 8 inches tall, 111 pounds. Name recorded as Klaus Werner Brandt, captured in Belgium during the collapse of the German Ardennes offensive in late January. Thinning blonde hair, gray eyes that had the particular quality of eyes that have recently stopped expecting anything. Through the translator, standing near the tent flap, Aldrich asked his question. "How long have your feet been like this?" Klaus Werner Brandt looked at the floor for a long time. Long enough that the translator shifted his weight from one foot to the other and looked at the doctor with an expression that asked whether he should repeat the question. Aldrich shook his head slightly. He waited. Finally, the young German spoke. 4 words in his own language. The translator said, "He says since the march." Aldrich set down his scissors. He picked up the intake form and read it again. Captured in Belgium, transferred by truck to a collection point near Liege, then by transport vessel across the Atlantic, then by military rail through Florida, Alabama, and into the heart of Texas. He calculated the time in his head. 3 weeks, possibly a little more. 3 weeks walking on feet that were dying inside the boots, and the young man on the bench had not said a word to anyone. Aldrich would spend the rest of that day and many days after it trying to understand why. The answer, when he finally found it, would change the way he thought about duty, about silence, and about the particular kind of courage that looks from the outside exactly like stubbornness. But that understanding was still weeks away. On that January morning, all Aldrich knew was that he had a 19-year-old prisoner with bilateral necrotic tissue damage severe enough to require immediate surgical intervention and a decision to make that no amount of medical training had fully prepared him for. He called for the head nurse and asked her to prepare the procedure room. Klaus Werner Brandt watched him go without changing his expression at all. To understand what those feet had been through, you need to go back 3 weeks. You need to go back to the forests of Belgium in the last days of January 1945, when the German Ardennes offensive had collapsed and tens of thousands of men were being taken prisoner in the bitter cold. The offensive itself had begun on December 16, 1944. Hitler had called it Operation Watch on the Rhine. The Americans would call it the Battle of the Bulge. It was Germany's last major push on the Western Front, a massive armored assault through the frozen Ardennes forests designed to split the Allied lines and drive to the port of Antwerp. For a few terrible days, it had seemed like it might succeed. American lines bent and broke in places. Entire units were surrounded. The town of Bastogne was encircled and besieged. The weather was so brutal that Allied air power was grounded for days, unable to fly. But the Americans held. Slowly, then decisively, the German advance stalled and reversed. By late January, the offensive was finished. And when it was finished, tens of thousands of German soldiers found themselves surrounded, cut off out of supplies, and facing a choice between fighting to the last or raising their hands. Most of them raised their hands. Klaus Werner Brandt was among them. He was not a veteran soldier. He had not been trained at any of the elite Wehrmacht academies or served with the Afrika Korps in North Africa. He was a member of the Volkssturm, the desperate final mobilization that Hitler had ordered in September 1944, calling up men and boys between the ages of 16 and 60 who had not already been conscripted. Klaus had received 4 weeks of training. He had been issued a rifle, a uniform, and boots that were standard Wehrmacht issued, designed for the European climate, but not designed for what the winter of 1944 to 1945 had in store. January 1945 was the coldest January recorded in that part of Europe in decades. Temperatures dropped to 15 degrees below 0 Celsius at night. Snow covered the Ardennes in drifts that came up to a man's knees in the low places. The forest that had been gloomy in autumn was transformed into something that looked in the dark like the surface of a world where nothing was supposed to survive. Klaus survived it for 6 weeks. Then he surrendered. There was one man in his unit that Klaus had come to trust in the way that young men in impossible situations sometimes come to trust the older men who happen to be standing nearest to them. His name was Friedrich Kessler. He was 34 years old, a shoemaker from a small town outside Munich, and he had been conscripted into the Volkssturm despite having spent most of the war finding increasingly creative reasons to be medically unavailable. He was not a coward in the conventional sense. He simply believed with the clarity that craftsmen sometimes have about practical matters that the war was lost and had been lost for some time, and that dying in a frozen Belgian forest was not going to change that. Kessler was the kind of man who noticed things. On the third night of the withdrawal that preceded Klaus's capture, he noticed that the boy was shivering in a way that was different from the shivering of the men around him. More violent, more sustained. He crouched beside Klaus in the darkness behind a stone wall and asked him quietly if his feet were hurting. Klaus said yes. Kessler told him to stomp his feet against the frozen ground every few minutes to keep the blood moving. He pulled a crumpled piece of newspaper from inside his coat and showed Klaus how to stuff it between the boot and the sock as insulation. Small knowledge, craftsman's knowledge. The knowledge of a man who had spent 15 years thinking about what feet need in order to stay functional. It helped for a while, but it was not enough. On the fourth night, the column of withdrawing soldiers stopped in an open field because the road ahead was blocked by a destroyed bridge. They sheltered there for 2 days while the officers tried to find an alternate route. The temperature dropped further. A storm moved in from the north. The guards distributed blankets, but there were not enough to go around. Kessler received a blanket. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Klaus, who had not received one and who was sitting with his back against a half-buried stone wall, trying to make himself small against the wind. Kessler handed the blanket over. Klaus refused. Kessler pushed it into his hands and said something simple in the tone of a man who does not intend to discuss the matter further. The translator at Camp Herne weeks later would render it approximately as, "You are younger than I am by 20 years. You need it more than I do." Kessler had spent enough winters in his shoemaker's workshop, which was not well heated, to know that he could endure the cold better than the boy beside him. He was probably right. He survived that night. Klaus was warmer than he would otherwise have been, but the boots were still not adequate. And the next morning, when the column moved again, the damage that had been building for days accelerated in ways that Klaus did not recognize because he had never been taught to recognize them. The feet hurt badly on the 5th day. The cold had a specific kind of bite that moved from outside the skin inward, like something drilling slowly through the layers. Klaus walked. He did not say anything because he had seen what happened to men who could not keep up. Temporary holding areas with no medical staff. Inadequate food. Men left waiting for transport that sometimes arrived too late. He had decided without quite framing it as a decision that he would walk as long as he could walk. On the 7th day, the pain stopped. That cessation of pain was not relief. It was not the body adjusting or the cold becoming more bearable. It was the sound of a door closing on something that would not reopen without medical intervention. The nerves in his toes and the front portions of both feet had been destroyed by the sustained cold. They had reached the threshold beyond which they could no longer transmit sensation, and they had gone silent. Klaus felt the silence as relief. He kept walking. He walked for 4 more days. He walked onto the transport truck. He walked up the gangway of the ship in the French port without assistance, because the intake sergeant asked if he was injured, and he said no. He walked through the processing stations in Florida. He walked onto the train that brought him through the American South and into the flat Texas landscape that looked nothing like anything he had ever seen before in his life. He walked off the transport truck at Camp Hearn on a Tuesday morning, and an intake guard noted in his report that prisoner 4412 had disembarked without assistance, but that his gate had looked and the guard had searched for the right word wrong. That word, written in a military intake report by a man who had no medical training, was accurate enough to have saved Klaus Werner Brandt's feet. Because of that word, the intake sergeant flagged the prisoner for priority medical examination. And that was how Klaus ended up on a wooden bench in the examination tent at Camp Hearn at 9 in the morning, with a doctor kneeling in front of him and cutting his bootlaces with surgical scissors. Camp Hearn had been established in 1942, commissioned by the United States Army, as a prisoner of war facility in Robertson County, Texas. It sat on 720 acres of flat Central Texas land, far enough from the coast to be outside the blackout zone and far enough from critical industries to satisfy security requirements. By the time Klaus arrived in early 1945, the camp had been operating for nearly 2 years and held close to 5,000 prisoners, the majority of them German. Most of them non-commissioned officers from the Africa Corps who had surrendered in Tunisia in May of 1943. The camp had its own internal rhythms and hierarchies. The American guards managed the perimeter and the overall operation. Inside the wire, however, the Germans managed themselves, and that internal management was not always peaceful. Camp Hearn had a history that the new arrivals from the Ardennes were not immediately told, but that they absorbed within their first days through the particular quality of certain silences and certain careful conversations. In December of 1943, a prisoner named Hugo Kraus had been beaten to death by a group of his fellow Germans. Kraus had been an interpreter cooperative with the American administration and openly skeptical of German victory. The men who killed him were loyal to the Nazi hierarchy that had been transplanted imperfectly but persistently into the internal life of the camp. The murder was documented, several men were convicted, but the atmosphere it had created did not dissipate simply because the specific perpetrators had been removed. There were still men at Camp Hearn in January 1945 who kept lists, who paid attention to who spoke to whom and for how long, who noticed when a prisoner seemed too comfortable with the Americans or too willing to accept what the camp offered without performing the appropriate rituals of resistance. Friedrich Kessler arrived at Camp Hearn 3 days before Klaus on a separate transport. He had asked about the boy from the moment he set foot inside the wire. He had asked the other new arrivals, the guards through a translator, the prisoner who distributed meal tickets, anyone who might have information. No one knew anything. The processing system had separated them, and the name Brandt did not appear in any list that Kessler could access. A veteran prisoner named Walter Schmidt had watched Kessler's inquiries with the particular patience of a man who has learned through long experience that patience is its own form of power. Schmidt had been at Camp Hearn since the summer of 1943. He was 41 years old, the former non-commissioned officer of the Africa Corps, and he carried himself with the authority of someone who had decided that the internal social order of the camp was worth maintaining, regardless of what was happening outside the wire. He came to Kessler on the second day and made his position clear without raising his voice. He said that asking too many questions of the Americans was noticed, that being seen to care too much about one prisoner, especially a prisoner in the medical facility, created impressions that were difficult to correct later. That Kessler was new here and would do well to understand how things worked before he did something that made his situation more complicated than it needed to be. Kessler listened to all of this with the attentiveness of a man who has learned that people who feel powerful and need to be heard before they can be negotiated with. Then he said that he was asking about a member of his unit, that this was a soldier's obligation to his comrades. that he intended to continue. Schmidt looked at him for a long moment, then he walked away without responding. Both men understood that the conversation was not over. In the medical wing, on the evening of the same day that Aldrich had first examined Klaus, the doctor sat in his small office with the intake form and the notes he had made during the examination and thought about what he was dealing with. The tissue damage was severe. Both feet had what Aldrich assessed as full-thickness necrosis in the toes and forward portions of the foot, meaning the damage had penetrated through skin, subcutaneous fat, and in some areas likely into the muscle. The infection risk was substantial. Gangrene could develop quickly in tissue this compromised. He could recommend amputation. Remove both feet at the ankle, eliminate the infection risk, and ensure the prisoner would survive without further complication. This was the conservative choice, the choice that minimized risk to the medical team and the camp administration, and the choice that would leave a 19-year-old man without feet for the rest of his life. He could recommend partial amputation, removing only the clearly necrotic tissue and attempting to preserve the remainder. This carried a higher infection risk, and if it failed, would require full amputation later anyway. Or he could attempt surgical debridement, cutting away all the dead tissue, disinfecting aggressively, and giving the remaining living tissue the best possible environment to recover. This option had the lowest success rate and the highest demand on medical resources, but it was the only option that gave Klaus Werner Brandt any chance of keeping functional feet. Aldrich sat with the form for a long time. He had been a military physician for 11 years, and in those 11 years, he had learned to read situations clearly enough to know when the institutional pressure was pointing him toward a decision that would be convenient for everyone except the patient. A transfer request had already appeared on his desk that afternoon, signed by Sergeant Earl Dunbar, a career enlisted man who managed camp logistics with the methodical precision of someone who measured every decision in columns of resources and cost. Fort Sam Houston, Dunbar had noted, had larger facilities, more staff, better resources for complex cases. What Dunbar had not noted, but what Aldrich understood perfectly, was that Fort Sam Houston also had a processing backlog that would put Klaus at the bottom of a long list, where a new surgeon who had never examined him would review his chart, see the extent of the damage, and make the conservative call. Aldrich picked up the transfer request. He read it a second time. Then he picked up a red pen from the cup on his desk, the pen he used for annotation, and he wrote across the bottom of the form, in letters large enough to be unambiguous: patient condition contraindicates transport. Transfer declined. Full written justification to follow. He signed it, placed it in the outbox for Dunbar's collection in the morning, and then he went to find the head nurse to schedule the procedure room for the following dawn. That same evening, in the small window of time between the end of the work detail and the dinner call, Friedrich Kessler stood outside the medical wing building in the fading Texas light. He stood there for a long time, still enough that a guard who passed him twice assumed he was simply taking the air. The windows of the building were small and the light inside was dim, and he could not see anything through them. But he stayed. A staff corporal who was coming out of the building at the end of his shift stopped when he saw the prisoner standing there. Through the standard gestures and the few words of German the corporal had picked up in his 2 years at the camp, he managed to communicate that the man in the medical wing was alive and was going to be operated on in the morning. Kessler nodded once. He looked at the building for another moment. Then he turned and walked back toward his barracks with the slow, deliberate step of a craftsman who has assessed a situation and decided that there is nothing more he can do tonight, but that tomorrow he will begin. Inside the medical wing, Klaus Werner Brandt lay on a clean cot for the first time in months and stared at the ceiling of the room with the expression of a person who has not yet permitted himself to believe that anything around him is real. The sheets smelled of military laundry soap. The room was warm from a kerosene heater in the corner. Outside the window, the flat Texas sky was enormous and very dark, and scattered across it in every direction were more stars than Klaus had seen since the last night before the offensive, when he had stood in the Belgian forest and looked up through the bare tree branches and thought briefly and without drama that it was a beautiful sky for a night that might be his last. It had not been his last night. He was here instead in Texas, in a warm room, about to have surgery while on feet he could not feel. He did not know if that was good. He did not know if anything was good yet. But the ceiling was solid above him, and the heater made a small sound in the corner, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, no one was asking him to walk anywhere. He closed his eyes. In the morning, Aldrich would take him into the procedure room and spend 2 hours cutting away the dead parts of him, searching with every careful stroke of the scalpel for the line where the living tissue began. In the morning, the work of deciding what could be saved would start. But that was in the morning. Tonight, Klaus Werner Brandt, 19 years old, 111 pounds, prisoner number 4412 at Camp Hearn, Texas, was still. And outside the window, somewhere on the other side of the wire, Friedrich Kessler was walking back to his barracks in the dark. And in the buildings around the camp, the machinery of an institution created to hold men in one place was doing exactly what it had been built to do. And somewhere in that machinery, without knowing it yet, a door had begun to open. On the fourth morning after surgery, the fever broke. Aldrich had been watching it for 3 days. Not the dramatic fever of a body overwhelmed and surrendering, but the low, persistent fever of a body that is fighting and has not yet decided which way the fight will go. Every morning at 6 before breakfast, before any other patient, he went to the isolation room where Klaus lay with both feet wrapped in sulfa-soaked gauze and checked the temperature chart that the night nurse had maintained through the dark hours. Day 1, 38.7 degrees. Day 2, 38.4. Day 3, 38.1. Day 4, 37.3. Aldrich stood at the foot of the cot and looked at the number for a long moment. Still elevated but no longer climbing. The infection had not entered the bloodstream. The sulfa drugs were doing their work. He looked at the gauze wrapping on both feet, looking for the specific discoloration that would tell him the worst was beginning. He did not see it. He went to the small window and stood there for a moment with his back to the patient, looking out at the camp. The sun was just coming up over the flat Texas horizon, and the light was the pale gold of early morning in winter, and the camp was beginning to fill with the sounds of 5,000 men starting another day inside a wire perimeter. He breathed. Then he turned around, went back to the chart, and wrote 2 words in the margin. Holding. Watch. He did not tell Klaus, not yet. In Aldrich's experience, hope communicated too early had a way of becoming its own kind of wound. The body could survive a great deal. The spirit, once allowed to rise and then knock back down, was a more fragile instrument. So he nodded at the young German on the cot, confirmed through the morning translator that pain levels were manageable, and left the room without changing his expression. Klaus watched him go with the patient attentiveness of someone who has learned to read information from the behavior of people who are not telling him things directly. He could not tell if what he saw in the doctor's face was good or bad. He decided to assume neither and to wait. Waiting was something he had become very good at. On the 5th morning, the edges of one wound showed the first sign of granulation tissue, a thin, slightly raised border pink rather than gray at the margin of one of the debridement sites on the left foot. Aldrich saw it under the examination loop and held very still for a moment before he allowed himself to note it in the chart. New tissue, the body building itself back one microscopic layer at a time. He still did not say anything to the patient, but that evening he sat in his office and wrote a letter to the camp medical inspector describing the case. He used careful clinical language throughout. But in the final paragraph, where professional convention permitted a degree of editorial observation, he wrote that in his assessment, given adequate time and resources, this prisoner had a reasonable chance of retaining functional lower extremities. He noted that this outcome would require continued investment of medical attention that some might consider disproportionate to the circumstances. He noted that it was his professional opinion that the circumstances were not a relevant variable in that calculation. He signed the letter, placed it in the outbox, and went home to his quarters and slept better than he had in several days. Thomas Garrett arrived at the medical wing 3 days later with a folding wooden chair under one arm and a set of parallel practice bars he had built himself from timber scraps in the carpentry workshop. He was 28 years old, a corporal from Wichita Falls, who had trained as a physical therapist before the war, and who had ended up at Camp Hearn because a knee injury from a training accident had made him undeployable overseas. He had spent 2 years treating wounded American soldiers at the camp facility, and in the gaps between those cases, he had occasionally worked with German prisoners whose injuries required rehabilitation. He set up the practice bars in the corridor outside the isolation room, measured the distance between them, adjusted the height, and stood back to look at his work with the appraising expression of a craftsman checking for level. Then he knocked on the isolation room door and went in to introduce himself. Klaus looked at the young American with the parallel bars in the corridor and the folding chair and said nothing. The translator explained who Garrett was and what he was there for. Klaus listened to the explanation without interrupting. Then he asked one question. When Garrett said, "Not yet, not for a while. First we talk about what the goal is." Klaus looked at the bars in the corridor and said, "The goal is obvious." Garrett pulled the folding chair up and sat down beside the cot. "Tell me what you think it is," he said through the translator. Klaus looked at him. "To walk." Garrett nodded. "To walk where?" The question hung in the room. Klaus had no immediate answer. For someone who had spent months with no destination other than the next checkpoint, the next transport, the next fence line, the concept of walking toward a chosen destination had become abstract in a way that was difficult to articulate. He said, "Wherever I need to go." Garrett nodded again as though this were a satisfactory answer, which he did not entirely believe but which would serve as a starting point. He stood up, looked at the chart one more time, and told the translator to tell the patient that they would begin light mobilization exercises in the bed in 2 days, and that the bars would become relevant after that. He left. Klaus looked at the ceiling. He thought about what "wherever I need to go" might mean for someone in his situation. He thought about Leipzig, where he had grown up, which was now in the Soviet zone of occupation. He thought about the family he had not heard from since before the offensive began. He thought about the boots that had been cut from his feet by a doctor he had never met before, in a language he still barely understood in a camp in the middle of a state that looked nothing like anywhere he had ever imagined ending up. He did not have an answer. But Garrett's question had done something that questions sometimes do. It had opened a space in his thinking that had not been there before, a space that required eventually to be filled. Friedrich Kessler had been at Camp Hearn for 2 weeks when Walter Schmidt came to find him a second time. The first conversation had been a warning. This one was different. Schmidt sat down across from Kessler at one of the long tables in the NCO recreation room, a space that the veteran Afrika Korps prisoners had made their own through the accumulated weight of 2 years of habitual occupancy. He sat with the deliberate ease of a man who knows he is in his own territory and wants you to know it too. He said that he had heard Kessler was still asking about the boy in the medical wing. Kessler said that he was. Schmidt said that he had also heard that Kessler had spoken to an American corporal near the medical building one evening. That this was the kind of behavior that attracted attention of a sort that Kessler might not want. Kessler poured himself a cup of the weak coffee that the camp canteen distributed in the afternoons and held it in both hands and looked at Schmidt with the expression of a man who has been making shoes for 15 years and has developed a great deal of patience for difficult materials. He said that he had asked the corporal whether a member of his unit was alive or dead. He said that he considered this an ordinary question between soldiers. He said that if Schmidt found something objectionable in that, he was willing to hear the specific objection. Schmidt looked at him for a long moment. The recreation room was half full of other prisoners, and the quality of the silence around their table had the particular texture of men who are paying close attention while appearing not to. Schmidt said, "The boy is not your unit. You were both Volkssturm. Volkssturm is not a unit. It is a collection of people who had nowhere else to go." Kessler said, "That is exactly right. And people who have nowhere else to go tend to look out for each other, in my experience." He drank his coffee. Schmidt watched him. After a moment, Schmidt stood up, straightened his uniform jacket in the habitual way of NCOs everywhere, and walked to another table without saying anything further. In the corner of the room, an older prisoner who had been reading a German novel throughout the conversation turned a page without looking up and did not comment. The following morning, Garrett began the bed exercises. He showed Klaus how to flex and extend the ankle joints, working the muscles that remain functional above the level of the debridement sites. He showed him isometric exercises for the calf and the quadriceps, the deep muscle groups that would need to compensate for what the feet had lost. He was patient and precise in his instruction, and he never expressed anything except professional interest in whether the exercises were being performed correctly. Klaus performed them correctly. He performed them with the slightly excessive conscientiousness of someone who has been told he is not capable of something and has decided to use that as a reason to be very thorough. On the second day of exercises, Garrett asked through the translator a question that had been forming in his mind since his first conversation with the patient. He asked during the march, Why didn't you tell someone your feet were damaged? Klaus did the flexion exercise 3 more times before he answered. Then he said in a tone that suggested he had thought about this question before and had arrived at an answer he found both accurate and somewhat puzzling in retrospect, because I did not want to be the reason the column stopped. Garrett looked at him. You were a prisoner. The column was not your responsibility. Klaus looked back at him with an expression that contained no disagreement, but also no concession. He simply appeared to find the statement incomplete. In some way, he did not have the English vocabulary to explain, and perhaps did not have the German vocabulary either, because some things live below the level of language, in the way that cold lives below the level of conscious awareness was doing its work, whether you are thinking about it or not. Garrett wrote the answer in his personal notebook that evening. He was not sure why. He simply felt it was the kind of thing that should be written down somewhere, even if he could not yet articulate why it mattered. Sergeant Earl Dunbar did not accept the rejection of his transfer proposal quietly. He was 42 years old, a career enlisted man from outside Knoxville, Tennessee, who had been assigned to Camp Hearn after a shoulder injury had taken him out of the active deployment pool. He was methodical and conscientious and genuinely committed to the efficient operation of the camp. He was also a man who had a brother serving in the Pacific Theater and who read every report that came across his desk about conditions in Japanese prisoner of war camps with the specific attention of someone who was taking it personally. He did not hate Germans in the way that the word hate implies passion. His feeling was colder and more administrative than that. It was the feeling of a man who has done a careful accounting of resources and concluded that the current allocation is not defensible. He reviewed Aldrich's case file on Klaus Werner Brandt with genuine thoroughness. He calculated the hours of physician time, the nursing hours, the cost of sulfa drugs and surgical materials, the bed occupancy in the isolation room, the projected requirement for ongoing physical therapy. He set these numbers against the total medical resources available at Camp Hearn and the total number of prisoners who required some level of medical attention, and he wrote up a second, more detailed proposal that was on its own terms a reasonable document. Fort Sam Houston, larger facility, more staff, more capacity for complex cases. He submitted it to Lieutenant Colonel George Morrison, the camp commander, on a Tuesday morning. Morrison read it and called Aldrich in that afternoon. Aldrich sat across the desk from his commanding officer and looked at the proposal for the first time. He read it carefully. Then he set it on the edge of Morrison's desk and looked at the wall behind Morrison's head for a moment, which was a habit he had when he was organizing his response to something. He said, "The patient cannot be safely transported in his current condition." Morrison said, "Dunbar seems to think otherwise." Aldrich said, "With respect, sir, Dunbar is not a physician." Morrison said that he understood that, but that Fort Sam Houston's facilities were genuinely superior, and that the transfer might ultimately be in the patient's best interest. Aldrich looked at Morrison directly and said what he actually thought, which he had not always done in 11 years of military medicine, but which he felt the situation required. He said, "Fort Sam Houston will amputate. They will look at the chart, see the extent of the damage, and make the conservative call. That is what a surgeon who has never examined this patient will do. I have examined this patient, I have seen what is recovering, and I have seen what the rate of recovery is. If you transfer him now, you will be transferring him to a procedure he would not have needed if he had been given adequate time and attention. That is my professional assessment." Morrison was quiet for a moment. He was the kind of commander who had learned to distinguish between the people who pushed back because they were protecting their own territory and the people who pushed back because they had looked at something carefully and were telling him something true. He said, "Write me a formal response to Dunbar's proposal. Medical justification, full detail by end of week." Aldrich said, "Yes, sir." He went back to his office and spent 3 evenings writing 32 pages of medical documentation. He cited the specific debridement procedure, the granulation tissue progress, the infection status, the projected recovery timeline, and the specific provisions of the Geneva Convention that required prisoner of war medical care to meet the same standard as care provided to the detaining nation's own troops. He wrote that last section carefully and without apology because it was the law, and he believed in it, and because he had reached the point in the situation where he felt that the principle was worth stating plainly rather than hiding inside clinical language. He submitted it on Friday morning. Dunbar received a copy. Dunbar did not respond directly, but sent a follow-up query to the regional medical inspector asking for an independent review of the resource allocation at Camp Hearns Medical Facility. The regional medical inspector requested a full accounting from Aldrich within 5 days. It was during those 5 days, while the paperwork moved through the system, that Klaus Werner Brandt had his first outdoor session. Aldrich had authorized it partly for medical reasons, and partly because he had watched the young German stare at the ceiling of the isolation room for 3 weeks, and had concluded that a ceiling, however solid and reassuring, was not sufficient for recovery. He asked a nurse to wheel the patient out to the small courtyard adjacent to the medical wing on a Saturday morning, when the weather was clear and the temperature had climbed to something that could be described as mild. Klaus sat in the wheelchair in the courtyard in the February sunshine and said nothing for a long time. The Texas sky above him was enormous and very blue in the particular way that the sky over flatland is always enormous, because there is nothing tall enough to interrupt it. The camp sounds surrounded him, voices in German and English, the distant clang of the carpentry workshop, the percussion of the kitchen beginning the late morning preparation. And then, from somewhere behind the main administrative building, the smell of frying pork came drifting on the morning air. It was Saturday. The camp kitchen occasionally prepared American breakfast on Saturday mornings as a camp management measure, something that cost relatively little and produced a measurable reduction in tension. Bacon in a cast iron pan, coffee in large metal urns, eggs scrambled in bulk. Klaus had not smelled bacon since before the war. Or rather, he had smelled it, but not in the way you smell things when you are 19 years old and have been living on military rations for the better part of a year, and your body has become very attentive to signals about food. The smell arrived at him in waves, rich and fatty and slightly smoky, and it did something to his attention that nothing medical had managed to do. It brought him entirely into the present moment. He was still sitting there, not quite smiling, but with a quality of presence in his face that had not been there before when Friedrich Kessler appeared at the edge of the courtyard. Kessler had a work assignment that morning in the courtyard area. He had arranged for this through the prisoner work allocation system, which he had learned to navigate in his 3 weeks at the camp with the practical intelligence of a craftsman adapting to unfamiliar tools. He was pushing a wheelbarrow of soil from the winter garden project, and when he came around the corner and saw Klaus in the wheelchair, he stopped. They looked at each other. Kessler set the wheelbarrow down. He walked over and crouched in front of the wheelchair the way you crouch in front of someone when you want to be at the same level, not looking down. He looked at the wrapped feet. He looked at the boy's face. He said in German without preamble, "How are the feet?" Klaus said. "Still there. Not much of them, but still there." Kessler said, "Better than the alternative." Klaus said yes. Kessler stayed crouching there for a moment. Around them, the camp went about its Saturday morning business. A guard passed at the far end of the courtyard and glanced at them without slowing down. The smell of bacon continued to drift from the direction of the kitchen. Kessler said, "Do you know what that smell is?" Klaus said. "Something good." Kessler said, "American bacon. I have had it 3 times since I arrived. It is not anything from home, but it is very good." Klaus looked in the direction the smell was coming from. He said after a moment, "Will they give me some?" Kessler said he did not know, but that it was worth asking. Then he stood, picked up his wheelbarrow, and went back to his work without further discussion. It was a short conversation. But when Garrett came to check on the patient an hour later and found him still in the courtyard, he noted that something in the young German's posture had changed. It was the posture of someone who had for the first time a small, specific desire about what would happen next, rather than simply an absence of expectations. He asked the duty nurse to see about the bacon. She came back 20 minutes later with a tin plate. Klaus ate it slowly in the way that people eat things they want to last and looked at the Texas sky. 6 weeks after the first surgery, Aldrich found what he had been watching for and dreading in roughly equal measure. The recovery was real and it was progressing, but the scar tissue forming at the debridement sites was contracting. Contracture, the medical term for it, meant that the collagen being laid down as the wounds closed was pulling the remaining tissue into configurations that were not functional. If uncorrected, it would lock the residual portions of both feet into a rigid, unusable position. The joints would stiffen, the tendons would tighten. The possibility of weight-bearing ambulation, which had been the entire point of the conservative treatment approach, would be lost. A second surgery was required. A contracture release followed by temporary pinning to hold the corrected alignment while healing continued. Aldrich explained this to Klaus through the translator on a Tuesday morning in March, sitting beside the cot in the way he always sat when he had something important to communicate, chair pulled close, elbows on knees at the same level. Klaus listened to the entire explanation without interrupting. Then he said no. Aldrich asked him to clarify. Klaus said, no more surgery. Aldrich said, without it, the recovery we have achieved will be partially reversed. You will not be able to bear weight normally. You will require assistance to walk. Klaus said, I have had enough of being cut. Aldrich recognized what he was looking at. He had seen it before in American soldiers who had reached the point of medical saturation, where the body's accumulated experience of intervention became its own barrier to further intervention. It was not irrational. It was the completely understandable response of a nervous system that had been through a great deal and was communicating in the clearest terms available to it that it needed the cutting to stop. He did not argue. He told Klaus he would give him 1 week to consider and that he would not schedule anything without the patient's consent. Then he found Garrett. He explained the situation in the corridor outside the isolation room, keeping his voice low. He said he needed Garrett to show the patient what his life would look like without the second surgery. Not in words, in practice. Garrett thought about it for a day. Then he came back with a plan. For 7 consecutive mornings, Garrett brought Klaus to the parallel bars in the corridor and had him practice the movements of daily life with his feet in their current, uncorrected configuration, walking the length of the bars, stopping, bending, standing again, navigating a step, turning in a small space. He brought a second chair and placed it at the far end of the corridor and asked Klaus to walk from one chair to the other and sit down. Simple domestic movements. The kind of movements you perform 40 times a day without thinking about them until you cannot. He did not editorialize. He did not say anything about what he was observing. He simply set up the exercises and watched and noted and occasionally adjusted Klaus's position when the compensatory movements he was developing were ones that would create new problems downstream. On the 5th morning, Klaus fell. He had been managing the length of the bars with increasing competence, but on the 5th morning, he attempted to turn without using the bars for support, and his weight distribution failed him, and he went down hard on one knee against the corridor floor. He stayed down for a moment. Garrett moved toward him and then stopped himself because Klaus was already beginning to get up, and the expression on his face was the expression of someone for whom accepting help in that moment would be a more significant injury than the fall itself. Klaus stood. He adjusted his position. He looked at the far wall of the corridor. He said not to Garrett, not quite to anyone. How long does this get better for Garrett said, with the surgery significantly. Without it, not much. Klaus was quiet. He walked the length of the corridor again without falling and sat in the chair at the far end. He sat there for a while. Garrett sat in the chair at the near end. The corridor was quiet in the way that hospital corridors are quiet in the mornings. A functional silence full of small sounds, the distant clatter of the medical wing breakfast service, the creak of the building in the morning wind, the sound of boots on the wooden floor from the guard changing at the perimeter. Eventually, Klaus said, schedule it. Garrett went to find Aldrich. The regional medical inspector's review of Aldrich's 32 pages of documentation had concluded 4 days after Dunbar submitted his request that the treatment was consistent with Geneva Convention obligations and could proceed. Aldrich read the approval in his office and felt something he recognized after a moment as the particular satisfaction of having been right about something that mattered. The contracture release surgery was performed the following Thursday morning. The procedure took 90 minutes. Aldrich cut through the scar tissue at 3 sites on each foot, repositioned the tendons, and inserted temporary pins to hold the corrected alignment. The procedure went without complication. Klaus came out of it in the recovery room with both feet in fresh plaster casts and an expression of someone who has submitted to something and is waiting to find out whether the submission was worth it. Aldrich came in at the end of the day and told him the surgery had gone as planned. Klaus looked at the white casts on both feet and asked how long. Aldrich said 6 weeks for the casts. Custom footwear after that. Ongoing physical therapy through the summer. Klaus said, and after all of that, Aldrich said, you walk. Not easily and not without some accommodation to what you have lost. But you walk. Klaus looked at the casts a moment longer. Then he looked at the window through which the late afternoon Texas light was coming in, at a low angle, the kind of light that makes everything it touches look like it is being illuminated for a specific purpose. He said quietly, as though the question were addressed primarily to himself. What for? Aldrich did not answer immediately. He was not sure in that moment that he had an answer. He was a physician. His expertise was in the mechanics of the body and the specific conditions under which those mechanics could be restored or improved. The question of what restored mechanics were for was, strictly speaking, outside his professional competence. But he had been listening to this young man for 6 weeks, and he had read the intake form enough times to know that Klaus Werner Brandt had walked for 11 days on feet that were dying because he did not want to be the reason the column stopped. And it seemed to Aldrich, sitting in the recovery room in the late afternoon light, that a person who could make that choice was not without resources for finding an answer to the question he had just asked. He said, "That is something you will have to figure out, but I expect you will." He stood, nodded at the patient, and left the room. In the corridor, he passed Friedrich Kessler, who was moving toward the recovery room with his eyes on the door and a small package tucked under one arm wrapped in burlap cloth. Kessler had obtained permission to visit through a chain of requests that had taken most of the week and involved the cooperation of 2 guards and the prisoner work coordinator. Aldrich looked at the package. Through the translator coming off shift at the end of the corridor, he asked what was in it. Kessler said, "I heard he will need custom shoes. I am a shoemaker." Aldrich looked at the package. He looked at Kessler. He thought about asking several questions and decided against all of them. He stepped aside. Kessler walked through the door. The cast came off on a Thursday morning in late April. Aldrich removed them himself, working the cast saw carefully along the seam he had marked 6 weeks earlier, and when the plaster fell away, he stood back and looked at what remained. The feet were pale and slightly atrophied from weeks of immobility, the skin thin and waxy in the way that skin becomes when it has been enclosed for a long time. But the alignment was correct. The contracture release had held. The pins had been removed 2 weeks prior, and the small entry points had healed cleanly. Aldrich pressed carefully along the restructured portions of each foot, checking for pain response, checking for swelling, checking for the specific indicators that would tell him whether the work of the past 4 months had achieved what he had believed it could. Klaus sat on the edge of the examination table and watched his own feet being handled with the expression of someone observing a process he is invested in but cannot control. Aldrich straightened up. He wrote in the chart for a moment. Then he looked at Klaus and said through the translator 3 words. "We are ready." Garrett came in 20 minutes later with the burlap package that Kessler had delivered to the recovery room 6 weeks before, which had been stored carefully in the medical wing supply closet since that evening. He set it on the examination table and opened the wrapping. Inside were 2 shoes. They were not elegant. They were built from a combination of leather salvage from the camp repair workshop and thick rubber sole material that Kessler had sourced through channels that the camp administration had chosen not to examine too closely. The heels were substantially reinforced, built up higher than a standard shoe to shift weight back and away from the absent front portions of the foot. The toe box was shortened and padded internally with layered felt. The lacing system ran further up the ankle than conventional footwear, providing support to the joint that would now need to carry compensatory load. They were structurally exactly what a trained shoemaker who had spent 6 weeks thinking about the specific biomechanical requirements of a bilateral partial foot amputation case would produce, given the materials available to him in a prisoner of war camp in Central Texas. Garrett looked at them for a moment before handing them over. In 2 years of physical therapy work, he had fitted many patients with adaptive footwear. He had never seen anything made by hand that was better thought through than what he was holding. He helped Klaus put them on. He laced them methodically, checking the fit at each eyelet, watching for any sign that the pressure distribution was causing discomfort. Klaus sat very still through this process, looking down at his feet in a way that was different from the way he had looked at them in the months since the surgery. There was something in his expression that had not been there before. Not hope exactly, something more cautious than hope, something like attention. Garrett finished lacing the second shoe. He stood up. He looked at Klaus. He said, "Stand up." Klaus placed both hands on the edge of the examination table and pushed himself upright. His weight transferred onto the soles of those shoes for the first time. The reinforced heels took the load. The ankle supports held. The padded toe boxes accommodated the restructured ends of both feet without pressure points. Klaus stood. He did not move for a moment. He simply stood and felt what standing felt like now, which was different from how it had felt before, but was standing nonetheless. Then he took one step away from the examination table, then another, then a third without holding on to anything. He walked the length of the examination room and stopped at the far wall and turned around. Garrett was watching him with the professional attentiveness of a man cataloging gait mechanics, heel strike angle, compensatory hip movement, lateral stability. He was noting all of these things accurately and with clinical precision, but he was also watching with something that was not clinical at all, which was the straightforward human experience of watching someone do something that 4 months ago had not been certain to be possible. Klaus walked back to the examination table. He sat down. He looked at the shoes for a long moment. Then he said, "Who made these?" Garrett pointed through the window of the examination room toward the open ground of the camp, where the morning work details were beginning to move through the April sunshine. Friedrich Kessler was in the garden area turning soil in the camp's vegetable plot with the slow, methodical rhythm of someone who is used to long work. He was wearing his prisoner uniform and a canvas hat he had traded for at the canteen, and he was not looking toward the medical wing. Klaus looked at him through the window for a long time. Then he said, "I need to go outside." Garrett checked with Aldrich. Aldrich signed off. A guard was assigned. 20 minutes later, Klaus walked out of the medical wing building into the Texas morning. The air outside was warm in the specific way of Texas in late April, carrying the smell of turned earth and grass and the faint distant sweetness of something flowering beyond the perimeter wire. The bluebonnets were in full bloom along the road outside the camp fence, great swaths of blue and purple that Klaus could see through the wire. He had not known what bluebonnets were before Texas. He had not known that a roadside could look like that. He walked across the open ground toward the garden area. His gait was slow and deliberate, each step placed with conscious intention, the weight transferred carefully from heel to the restructured midfoot to the residual push-off. It was not the walk of someone who was unaware of walking. It was the walk of someone for whom every step was a decision and who had decided on each one to keep going. Kessler saw him coming when he was about 20 yards away. He stopped turning soil. He straightened up slowly the way men in their mid-30s straighten up after crouching with a brief acknowledgement of effort and stood with the garden tool in both hands and watched Klaus approach. Klaus stopped in front of him. He looked down at the shoes. He looked up at Kessler. He said, "Why did you do this?" Kessler looked at the shoes for a moment. He set the garden tool against the fence. He sat down on the low wooden border of the garden plot, the way men sit when they are going to say something that requires a different posture than standing. He said, "I had a son. He would have been about your age now, a little younger. He died before the war. Diphtheria." He paused. He looked at his hands, which were soil-stained from the morning work. "There is nothing logical about it." "I am aware of that." Klaus sat down on the other end of the garden border. Around them, the camp continued its morning operations. Guards moved along the perimeter. Prisoners carried equipment between buildings. The ordinary machinery of the place went about its business. Klaus said, "I did not know." Kessler said, "No." They sat in the April sunshine and did not speak for a while. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, a mockingbird was working through its repertoire in the branches of a live oak, cycling through imitations of other birds with the focused energy of a creature that has no interest in silence. The Texas morning moved around them. Eventually, Klaus said, "I do not know what happens next." Kessler said, "No, neither do I." It was an honest answer. And in May of 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender signed on the 8th of the month, and the camp beginning the long, uncertain process of determining what came after, honest answers were about the best that anyone could offer. The news of Germany's surrender reached Camp Hearn through the camp radio and through the guards who came on shift that morning with information that had not yet become ordinary. For the American personnel, it was the end of something enormous and the beginning of something whose shape was not yet clear. For the German prisoners, it was more complicated than any single word could hold. Kessler heard it from a prisoner who came into the barracks at 6 in the morning and said the war was over in the flat voice of someone reporting weather. Kessler sat on his bunk for a long time afterward. He thought about Munich, which was in the American occupation zone and was presumably still standing, or at least partially standing. He thought about his workshop, which he had locked in September of 1944, when the conscription notice arrived, leaving his tools on the bench in the middle of a pair of boots he had been resoling for a customer. He thought about whether the customer had ever come back for those boots and what she must have thought when she found the workshop locked with no explanation. He thought about his wife, from whom he had received no word since January. He told himself that the absence of word was not the same as bad news. He had been telling himself that for 4 months. Across the camp in the barracks that housed the Africa Corps veterans, Walter Schmidt sat in the recreation room and looked at the table in front of him for a long time. He did not speak to anyone that morning. In the afternoon, he came out into the yard and walked the perimeter of the inner compound 3 times with the purposeful stride of a man who is using his legs to process something his mind is not yet ready to address. Before he went back inside, he stopped at the edge of the yard and stood looking at nothing in particular for a moment. Then he went in. In the medical wing, Klaus received the news from Garrett, who told him simply and without editorial comment. Klaus nodded. He asked Garrett a question that Garrett had not expected. He asked, "Is there a way to stay?" Garrett said he did not know. He said he would find out. The answer, which emerged through the camp administration over the following weeks, was that there was a process. The displaced persons provisions, which would be formalized into law in 1948, but which existed in practice through executive policy before that, it allowed prisoners of war who could not safely return to their home regions to apply for residency in the United States under sponsorship. Klaus's home was in the Soviet occupation zone. Leipzig was behind what was already being called in certain quarters an Iron Curtain. Returning there as a former Wehrmacht soldier, regardless of how young or reluctant that soldier had been, was a prospect with consequences that were difficult to predict and not difficult to fear. Aldrich wrote a letter in support of Klaus's application. It described the medical situation, the ongoing requirements for specialized footwear and periodic assessment, and the difficulty of ensuring continuity of care in the context of repatriation to a Soviet-administered zone. In the final paragraph, in language that was as personal as Aldrich allowed himself to be in official correspondence, he wrote that in his assessment, this was a young man who had demonstrated significant capacity for survival and adaptation under difficult conditions, and that the United States would not be diminished by providing him the opportunity to apply those qualities within its borders. He did not tell Klaus he had written it. The processing took months. Klaus remained at Camp Hearn through the summer in a changed camp, a camp that was winding down, losing prisoners to repatriation at a rate of dozens per week. The population shrank. The noise level dropped. The gardens that the prisoners had cultivated with such elaborate care through the spring began to outpace the labor available to maintain them. Kessler received his repatriation notice in late October, part of the large-scale movement of prisoners that the Army began processing in the fall of 1945, routing men through Fort Bliss and then to embarkation points on the East Coast before the Atlantic crossing and the long return to a Europe that had been remade by 5 years of war. He found Klaus in the medical wing courtyard on the morning before his transport date. Klaus had been doing his daily walking circuit, the route that Garrett had marked out for him through the courtyard and the adjacent corridor, the route that had started as 15 minutes and had grown over the summer months to 45 minutes of continuous movement. Kessler waited until he had finished. Then he reached into the pocket of his uniform jacket and produced a small object. He held it out. It was a shoemaker's awl, small, steel shafted with a worn wooden handle that had been shaped by years of use into the specific contours of the hand that had used it, the most fundamental tool of the trade, the thing you reach for first and last. Klaus looked at it. Kessler said, "This is not worth anything in a war. In peacetime, a man who knows how to use this can always find work." Klaus said, "I am not a shoemaker." Kessler said, "Then learn. You already know the most important part." Klaus looked at him. "What is that?" Kessler said. "You know what feet need." He pressed the awl into Klaus's hand. He gripped his hand around it for a moment, the way you grip someone's hand when words are not sufficient and you know it, and they know it, and the grip itself is what needs to be communicated. Then he let go. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Klaus for one more moment with the expression of a man who is making a memory on purpose deliberately because he is aware that this is the last time. Then he turned and walked toward the staging area where the transport vehicles were assembling. Klaus stood in the courtyard and watched him until the transport vehicle turned out of the camp gate and the road outside was empty. He stood there a while longer after that, looking at the gate. Then he looked down at the awl in his hand. The wooden handle was warm from Kessler's pocket. He closed his fingers around it. He stood there in the Texas sun in the shoes that Kessler had made, holding the tool that Kessler had left, and understood that he was now carrying both the gift and the obligation that came with it. In December of 1945, Klaus Werner Brandt walked out of Camp Hearn through the main gate on a clear Texas morning with a canvas bag over one shoulder and a sealed envelope of medical documents in his hand. The envelope contained his complete case file and Aldrich's letters of support and a handwritten note that Aldrich had tucked in at the last moment and addressed to the physician of the family who would sponsor him in Pennsylvania, describing the ongoing footwear requirements and the physical therapy protocols that had produced the best outcomes. At the bottom of the note in the margin, Aldrich had written one sentence that was not addressed to any physician. He had written, "This young man walked for 11 days on feet that were dying because he did not want to be a burden. Make sure someone tells him that the walking he does from here on is for himself." He had folded the note before he fully decided whether he intended that sentence to be read. Then he had sealed the envelope before he could take it back out. Klaus walked through the gate without turning around. The road ahead of him was Texas highway flat and straight, running between fields of dry winter grass to a horizon that seemed impossibly far away. The morning sun was at his back. The shadow it cast in front of him was long and slightly asymmetrical. The shadow of a person whose gait was not entirely standard and never would be, but who was walking under their own power on shoes built by a man who understood what feet need toward whatever was ahead. He did not know what was ahead. He knew Lancaster, Pennsylvania, because the paperwork said Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and there was a family there who had agreed to provide housing and help him find work. He knew that his home city of Leipzig was behind a border that was becoming less like a boundary and more like a wall with every week that passed. He knew that Kessler was somewhere in Munich by now, presumably back in his workshop, with the tools that had been waiting on the bench since September of 1944. He knew that he had an awl in his bag and a great deal to learn about using it. He walked to the road. In Lancaster, Pennsylvania in the spring of 1952, Klaus Werner Brandt was 25 years old and had been operating a small shoe repair business from a workshop attached to the back of the house where he rented 2 rooms. He had learned the trade from the father of the family who had sponsored him, a retired German-American farmer named Heinrich Reuter, who had emigrated from Saxony in 1908 and who had spent his early years in America doing every trade available to a man with good hands and limited English. Reuter had no particular expertise in shoemaking, but he had expertise in learning, and he had passed that on along with the workshop space and the basic tools. Klaus had supplemented Reuter's instruction with the knowledge he found he already carried. He knew better than most shoemakers what feet need when they have been compromised. He knew the pressure points, the weight distribution, the places where a poorly constructed shoe causes damage that accumulates slowly and reveals itself late. He had learned these things from the inside, from Garrett's exercises, from Aldrich's examinations, from the specific daily education of walking on feet that required him to pay attention to every step. His customers noticed. Word moved through Lancaster in the way that word moves through small communities, and after 2 years he had more work than he could comfortably manage. One of his regular customers was a man named Thomas Alderman, a retired postal worker who had served in the Army Signal Corps during the war and who came in every 4 months for resoling and occasional repair. Alderman and Klaus rarely discussed the war. They discussed the boots, the leather, the particular wear patterns that Alderman's job had produced over the decades of walking. One April morning, Alderman brought in a pair that needed significant work. He sat down in the customer chair by the window and looked out at the Lancaster street for a moment. He said without looking away from the window, "My unit went through Belgium in January of '45. Worst cold I ever felt." Klaus was already at the workbench beginning the disassembly. He said yes. Alderman said hell of a winter. Klaus said yes. They did not discuss it further. But when Alderman came back 2 days later for his boots, he looked at the resoling work and said it was the best he had seen in the county. Klaus said thank you. Alderman paid and left. Klaus put the money in the cash box and went back to the pair he was currently working on. He worked until the light failed, then locked the workshop and went inside and ate dinner at the small table by the window, where he could see the Lancaster street in the evening light. He thought about Camp Hearn often enough. He thought about Aldrich's deliberate nod at the end of examinations, the way it communicated completion without sentimentality. He thought about Garrett's parallel bars in the corridor and the folding chair and the question about wherever I need to go. He thought about the Saturday morning bacon smell drifting across the courtyard when he had sat in the wheelchair for the first time outdoors, and how that smell had been the first thing in a very long time that had made him want something specific. He thought about Kessler. He had written to Munich twice to the address that Kessler had given him in the last minutes before the transport vehicle. He had received one reply, brief and practical, confirming that the workshop was operational again and that there was more work than there had been before the war because shoes, it turned out, were needed by everyone regardless of what they believed in. The letter had ended with one sentence that was not practical. It had said, "Walk well." Klaus had kept the letter in the drawer of the table where he ate his meals. In Munich in the spring of 1992, a woman named Anna Brandt was clearing the contents of her father's house. Klaus Werner Brandt had died in February at 65 years of age of a cardiac event that his physician described as not unexpected, given his history, meaning the history of a body that had been through a great deal and had done its best with what remained. He had lived in Munich since 1963, when he had moved back to Germany after becoming a citizen of the United States in 1958. The country he had been born in had changed enormously in those years, and he had felt, without being able to fully explain it, that the changed version was the one he needed to see for whatever time was left. He had built a shoe repair business in Munich as he had built one in Lancaster. He had married in 1965 to a woman named Gertrude, who was a school teacher and who had the specific patience of school teachers for people who communicate through demonstration rather than words. They had Anna in 1967. Gertrude died in 1981. Klaus spent the last 11 years of his life in the house on the edge of the city where the streets became quieter, maintaining his workshop until 2 years before his death, when his hands began to lose the precision that the work required. He did not speak much about the war. The war was a room in the house of memory that many people of his generation had chosen to keep closed, not because it did not exist, but because the effort required to open it was greater than what daily life could accommodate. Anna had understood this without being told. She had grown up with a father whose walking was distinctive, whose shoes were always custom, whose feet were something she had understood from childhood, were a subject with weight to it. She had not asked. She had observed. Now she was in his study, going through the desk and the bookshelves and the drawer of the side table, placing things in categories. Things to keep, things to give away, things whose meaning she was not yet sure of. In the bottom drawer of the side table, under a German novel whose spine was cracked from multiple readings and a folder of old insurance documents, she found a wooden box. Small, plain, locked with a leather strap closure that had stiffened with age. She worked the strap open. Inside the box were 2 items. The first was a shoemaker's awl, small, steel shafted, with a handle worn into the specific shape of a hand that was not her father's hand, because the wearing was old in a way that predated anything she knew of her father's life. The wood was dark from decades of handling. It was clearly a tool of significance, kept rather than used. The second was a sealed envelope. On the outside, in her father's handwriting, were 2 words in German: for Anna. She sat down on the floor of the study with her back against the desk, the way she had sat on the floor as a child when she needed to think about something, and she opened the envelope. Inside was a sheaf of papers, medical documents, she realized after a moment, dozens of pages formal military medical documentation on United States Army letterhead dated from January through December of 1945. At the top of the first page in the header, she read the words, Camp Hearn, Texas. She read the patient name. She read the case summary. She sat there for a long time reading. At the back of the sheaf, clipped separately, was a single folded sheet. She unfolded it. It was a handwritten note, the ink faded to brown at the edges, the paper thinner than modern paper with the particular texture of wartime stationery. It was addressed to a physician in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, describing medication protocols and footwear specifications. But at the bottom, in the margin, in handwriting that was different from the rest, smaller and less formal, as though added as an afterthought by someone who had decided at the last moment that something needed to be said, she read a single sentence. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time. Outside the window of the study, Munich in the spring of 1992, was doing what Munich does in spring, which is to say that the city was becoming beautiful in the specific way of Northern European cities. When the cold finally releases its hold and the light returns and people come out onto the streets with the slightly dazed expressions of people who had almost forgotten that the world could look like this. The wall had come down 3 years ago. The country had been reunified. The Iron Curtain that Klaus had feared in 1945 had been drawn back, and what was behind it was complicated and damaged and ongoing, but it was no longer sealed. Anna sat on the floor of her father's study and held the letter from a doctor she had never heard of, who had worked in a camp in Texas in a chapter of her father's life that had never been spoken about, and read the sentence in the margin again. She thought about her father's walk, which she had known all her life, the specific rhythm of it, the deliberate placement of each step that she had assumed was simply how he moved and had never thought to trace to a source. She thought about the shoes he had always worn custom-built, which she had assumed were a professional habit from his years as a shoemaker. She thought about the awl in the box, which she now understood was not her father's awl, and which he had kept for nearly 50 years without using it. She thought about a young man of 19 in a Belgian forest who had walked for 11 days on feet that were dying because he did not want to be the reason the column stopped. She thought about a doctor who had written 32 pages of documentation to keep that young man in one place. She thought about a shoemaker who had spent 6 weeks building a pair of shoes from workshop scraps for someone who was not his son. She sat there for a long time. The Munich spring went on outside the window. People walked on the streets below each of them onto their own particular feet in their own particular shoes, going wherever they were going. Eventually, she folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. She set the envelope in the wooden box alongside the awl. She closed the box and worked the leather strap back into place. She carried it to the table by the window, the table where her father had eaten his meals for the last 11 years of his life, and she set it there in the afternoon light. Then she sat down, looked at it for a moment, and understood something that her father had apparently understood without being able to say it, which was that some things are too large to explain to the people you love, not because you do not trust them, but because the explaining would require you to go back to a place whose geography you have spent decades learning to live alongside without being consumed by it. And sometimes the most honest thing you can do is put the evidence in a box and trust that the person who opens it will be able to read what it says. The sentence in the margin, the one that Captain Robert Aldrich had written on a December morning in 1945 in a camp in central Texas, while a young German prisoner walked through the gate and onto a flat road heading north. The sentence that he had sealed into the envelope before he could take it back. The sentence that had traveled from Texas to Pennsylvania to Munich in the bottom drawer of a side table for nearly 50 years, read as follows. This young man walked for 11 days on feet that were dying because he did not want to be a burden. Make sure someone tells him that the walking he does from here on is for himself. No one had told him, but he had figured it out anyway. And the shoes he had made for other people for 40 years in a workshop in Lancaster and then in a workshop in Munich were evidence of that figuring out one pair at a time, one set of feet at a time, one customer who walked out the door better supported than they had walked in. That is what the walking was for. That is what it had always been for.